be covering subjects, obstacles, including propaganda techniques, old and new, digital surveillance, digital techniques being used by governments to both to surveil journalists, but also to influence the public debate, which we're seeing used in lots of different ways in lots of different countries. Commercial pressure on journalists and how that can influence or attempt to influence journalism today. And also threats in other forms. So I'm going to pass over to Thomas, who is going to kick off just to talk a little bit about who he is and what's happening in Hungary.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Tamás Bodok. I'm a journalist since more than 20 years now, and 5 years ago I funded a small NGO for investigative journalism in Hungary. The reason why we started this NGO is because the freedom of the press in Hungary is more and more in danger. In the early 1990s, the press played a very progressive role in fighting the powers and distributing democratic values, but then gradually it became a tool of different political and business interests, and in the 2000s even most of the foreign investors left, media investors left Hungary, and the media owners now are businessmen who typically made their fortune since the 90s in strong dealings with the state, so their businesses are closely tied to the goodwill of the political powers, and that puts a serious limit or constraint on how their media can expose corruption and political scandals. So I looked around how other countries deal with this problem, and I noticed that there are a lot of non-profits for investigative journalism, because that eliminates the problem of the politically connected owner who doesn't like you to expose his business partners in political parties and in the government. And the non-profits are owned by the journalists themselves who do the actual work. So I decided to try this business model in Hungary and funded this non-profit, and it is successful. So after 5 years we are 6 journalists, and a lot of freelancers work for Átlátszó, but it's still a very small enterprise, and it has become under attacks from the government and governing parties for its critical coverage. Unfortunately, in Hungary, what we are experiencing now is that the government sees the media as a tool for preserving its power. So what the government did is to turn we have a huge state-owned media, so-called public service media in Hungary, which is run by the state and costs the taxpayers a lot of money. And before 2010 it was more or less independent, but now it has been turned into a propaganda machine for the government, and all the journalists are so-called pro-government journalists there. And also the government is buying private media or buying media companies and turning them into pro-government mouthpieces, while the jobs for critical journalism or independent journalism are shrinking. Opposition media is shrinking, and a huge propaganda machine is trying to discredit whatever we whatever we come up with.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Maria Stepanova and I come from Russia. Thank you for being here in this glorious summer afternoon. I'll try to say a few short words about what we are doing. I'm a founder and an editor-in-chief of the Kolta.ru. It was founded 10 years ago as a cultural daily publication. Because we had this feeling that cultural issues were undercovered at the time. But as the time passed, and well, in the next few months, we found out that we just have to add a society section to our daily routine, because the events in Ossetia happened in the autumn of 2008, and we had just we had no choice but to follow them. Now, we used to exist under a different name, openspace.ru. And in the spring of 2012, the spring of protests in Russia, our website was closed. And we reopened it after under a different name and following a different business model. And now Kolta.ru is it was the first one, and it's still an only totally crowd-funded publication in Russia. This means we are constantly facing a challenge, because it is easy to raise some money for launching something, for making a new film, for instance, or even for launching a publication. But it is rather hard to find money month after month in a hostile environment. When I am thinking of things we are doing, and we are getting more and more political with every year and every month. Of course, when you're writing about culture, well, cultural is political, but we are facing to be more and more direct. There is no choice, as it seems. I kind of hesitate to speak about what we are doing as a sort of an activism, because there is a number of people and publications who are much more brave, and they are struggling against the state's pressure every day. But when you come to think about what is going on in Russia currently, every kind of an independent activity rapidly becomes activism. And especially if you are having in mind a number of newborn laws directly that were issued directly to silence the independent media. I will name just a few things that could happen instantly to any kind of a publication, including personal blogs with a certain audience, more than 3,000 followers. You can anytime face one of the following problems. You could be instantly blocked without a court's decision if the content of your publication is considered to be extremism. This could mean anything. Your publication could be named a foreign agent if what you are doing is treated as a political activity. That also could be anything. If you are covering, for instance, the elections or the problems that are existing in the Russian army, or whatever else, anything could be named a political activity, and you could be persecuted because of that. Also, you could be subject to a penalty or even jailed in certain cases if your content is viewed as risky. For instance, if you're covering the gay rights issues, it could be called homosexual propaganda, and it becomes an easy cause for a legal process. And there is the worst thing. You are finding yourself in a situation of constant self-censorship. You're refusing yourself to touch certain subjects, trying to avoid the things I've just named. That makes an ordinary daily situation of every journalist working in Russia, it makes it more and more complicated. And there is the starting point for me of our dialogue.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming by. I want to thank volunteers who are working here at this wonderful conference especially, and to note that the hardest working people in this room are the ones in the booth there, the interpreters, and I thank you for what you all do. It's wonderful stuff. I haven't been a full-time journalist for a number of years, and when I was doing it in a place where journalists are generally not at risk, or at least have not been. I have had a few threats over the years, a few situations where I was scared, but I don't face anything, never faced anything, and most American journalists don't face anything even today that resembles what our other two speakers have just told you about, and I want to emphasize how humble I feel in the same room with people who are risking a lot more than we do in America all the time. I was in Mexico recently speaking with journalists who are being, their colleagues are being killed on a fairly regular basis. And in the travels I do around the world, I'm constantly reminded of what a luxury American journalists have even today. I fear that may be changing in my country. Certainly, Trump made it clear during the campaign that he was not going to be friendly to journalists who were not friendly to him. I think he's going to pursue that quite vigorously in all kinds of ways. We haven't seen yet a lot of things that I expect will happen. But I would note that this week Twitter filed a lawsuit in federal court because the Trump administration has demanded the unmasking of someone anonymous who has been just criticizing the government. This is something new in America and something that everyone in my country has to pay attention to. And I'm worried that our tradition and belief in freedom of the press, freedom of expression, is eroding, and that will give people in other countries, other governments, even more reason to push hard against journalism there. The thing that I want to just emphasize is the need for journalists to be thinking a lot harder around the world about their own security in a number of ways, and electronic is obviously one of them. If a nation state wants to spy on you, it's going to be very hard to stop that, but there still are plenty of measures that journalists can employ to be safer than they've been. I'm telling this to people who probably are way ahead of Americans in this category, but it's something we all in journalism have to pay a lot more attention to. I don't want to get too far into the details of it if anyone wants to pursue it later, but my bottom line belief is we're in for a very, very hard time for freedom of the press in the next decade or so around the world, and that would include my own country. And I think that journalists have to think of themselves when it comes to matters of freedom of expression and freedom of the press. Journalists are going to have to become, if they are not already, they have to become activists to protect it. in their own countries and around the world. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much for all those contributions. I just wanted to kick off with a few questions for the panel that also I hope to provoke some questions from the audience as well. I just wanted to ask everyone about what they see as the biggest threat ahead, whether it is about challenges to encryption or personal safety or commercial pressure. Thomas?
Okay, so in Hungary, it's most definitely political meddling with the matters of the press. So the Hungarian government doesn't think that the press has a role of a watchdog or a autonomous entity. They see the press clearly as a propaganda tool. And if it works for them, if this is a outlet which is financed by the government or the governing party and echoes their issues and their agenda, then it's fine. And anyone else is considered as a threat for them. And they are actively going after critical voices. So just this week in Hungary, they announced that they passed the law which makes possible to shut down the biggest or best Hungarian university, which is sponsored by George Soros, because they decided that George Soros is the enemy now. So last year it was the migrants and the refugees, so they campaigned against the migrants, although we don't have any migrants in the country now, but everyone hates them because the country was full of billboards that they are going to take away our jobs and they are all terrorists and so on. And now this year, this hate-mongering switched to target George Soros and the foreign influence in general. So they shut down the best university. They introduced the law to discredit foreign-funded NGOs as foreign agents. So it's the same law that Russia already has, and it demands NGOs which receive any amount of foreign funding to register themselves as a foreign agent and indicate all their publications that they are foreign agent, and then on the other side, the government propaganda will discredit them in a very condemnatory way. So of course there is surveillance. We have felt the surveillance a couple of times. We were working on stories, and suddenly the target of our investigation calls that, oh, I know you are working on this story, and I would like to speak about this without us contacting them. But I think the main threat is that the whole media system gets transformed into a propaganda machine instead of an independent watchdog system.
I think that I would name 3 major tendencies that seem to me to be of huge importance. The first one is something I've already mentioned, and this is a matter of self-censorship that is becoming more and more important in the shrinking field of independent journalism in Russia. Because now the state, the government, is behaving in a more wise way than it used to do 50 or 70 years ago. It doesn't need anymore to jail people. It just scares them to death, and they are controlling themselves in a better way than any state authorities could. This means that you are always, when it comes to writing or commissioning a certain piece, when it comes to publishing it, when it comes to the matters of editing it, you are always facing a number of questions. If you have to omit something, if you have to be outspoken enough, you are always thinking about the consequences, because you are always facing a number of consequences. They may happen or not. You could be fired, your editorial staff could be fired, your publication could be closed, or maybe not. You never know well enough. And it is something that distorts you deep inside. And it is something that independent journalists are facing every day. The second thing is the number of economical pressures. And it is also very important, because the ugliest thing is that we have to compete with the state media, who are having an unlimited source of money, opportunities, ways of buying the independent journalists out. And it is always important, because people are quitting, they are leaving, and sometimes we're losing journalists, and then in a few months' time they're appearing in the governmental media, in the state media, where they're being paid huge wages. And it is really hard to compete. A few months ago, I was meeting with a number of students who enrolled for a certain educational program that is being paid for by a number of foreign funds. And it was interesting, because they were quite outspoken. There was a lovely girl in her early teens who told me directly that she sees no difference between truth and lies. She told me that she lives in some suburban place at the outskirts of Moscow. She has no money, or her family has no money, and that she will do anything, just anything, to get out her miserable life. And I was trying to give her examples, well, any kind of examples. People jailed for nothing, terror attacks, whatever. But she was absolutely certain in her she knew her decision was already made. There was nothing to be done about it. And it is also an important factor, because it is hard to sustain your independence in the economical framework of the crisis we're facing today. Even our humble publication is losing its donors every day, because the ordinary people who are donating like $20 per month are facing economical challenges. They are unable to help every publication they would like to. And so they are choosing between the Dozhd and Novaya Gazeta and Kolta and a limited number of other independent publications. They have to choose one or two. And it is an uneasy situation. And our donators who used to help us with the biggest amounts are trying now to be as invisible as possible, because Kremlin is treating everyone who is getting involved with the media, it could be glossy magazines, sports stuff, whatever, as actors in the political field. They are becoming noticed. And if there are businessmen, for instance, it has serious consequences for their work and future. So they are unwilling to help. It puts every independent media in a dangerous position. And the last thing I would like to mention is the crisis of the whole Institute of Expert Knowledge. Because what is going on in every state media I am following is, just imagine a round table where there is one or two real experts, some doctors, professors, some people who know what they are speaking about. And to make the conversation more lively, the state media are adding people out of nowhere. Some astrologists, some conspirologists, but with a huge badge expert written, all over their chests. And what I am thinking is they have a good reason, because what they are trying to persuade the audiences is there is no truth, there is no knowledge, there is no way of doing an expertise. And that is the air people are breathing. And of course, it changes and distorts the relationship of an audience and the publications they are following. This thing has the most prolonged, the most serious consequences I can predict.
Thank you. From Index's point of view, I just wanted to pick up on a few of the things that Maria has been talking about, because we're seeing them as trends across the world. We actually have a project called Mapping Media Freedom, which charts attacks on journalists in 42 countries in and around Europe. And certainly we can track changes that are happening in one country's picking up from another, but obviously we are also seeing those things across the world. So the techniques that Trump's been using, so calling out fake news against newspapers and media that he doesn't like, is very similar to what Correa was doing in Ecuador, or what's been happening in Argentina. So it's like you can see the way that one state is watching what's happening in another state and thinking, oh, well, we can use that technique, and therefore we can use that to undermine public trust in the media, so that people no longer believe potentially in what those journalists are saying, which helps us with our mission to persuade them of something else. So, as both Maria and Thomas have been saying, the idea of you condemn, or you say foreign money can't be used here in any way, they're foreign agents, therefore anything that comes out of those media because they're receiving some international funding is to be distrusted. You're seeing that again and again in lots of different countries. And the use of the idea of patriotism, so that if anybody criticizes a government, it somehow becomes anti-patriotic. We see, we're charting in lots of different countries across the world. So I think, it's not that these things are reserved for one country. Everyone is sort of feeding what's happening in other countries. And we're actually seeing, we're currently looking at a report about attacks on the media in the US. You might be interested in, actually, Dan. So over to you.
This war on truth that's going on all over the world is a huge problem, and I'll expand on this a bit. And what you've heard is absolutely right. And by the way, the closing of Central European University is just catastrophic for all kinds of reasons, and I'm appalled by it. But authoritarian governments in particular, and people who want to create them from nominally democratic systems, this is a tactic. This is part of what they do. They make truth into kind of an opinion. They devalue reality. They challenge fundamental science. And in the US, this is taking on quite a powerful force, which, as someone who has grown up with and believes in facts and truth, is pretty terrifying to me. But I'll also say that the media in my country have been part of the problem in many ways. Even our best, well, I don't like using the word best with television in America. That they don't fit together. But television news in the U.S. is terrible. And we put on, our CNN and others put on experts who don't know what they're talking about, or who will just lie directly. And then they'll put them on again, even knowing that they're going to lie. So this is not just the so-called fake news crowd, it's our traditional media in the U.S. that are part of it. We have really big problems in this category, but I'll tell you about two other ones that I'm increasingly concerned about that have not yet been mentioned. The most significant one is part of the technology that we're all using now. And that is that the internet and personal technology, personal computers, and these are personal computers, just smaller, but this all was developed in a decentralized way, where anyone could essentially say anything and anyone else could have access to it. That was the principle for the internet and personal technology. Most of this is being re-centralized. And that is a huge problem for our futures as journalists if we don't deal with this in a very serious way. When I say re-centralization, I'm talking about both government control and corporate control. So the telecom companies, the mobile carriers and wired line internet service providers are centralized companies that have enormous power over whether what we say can get to the people we want to read it or hear it. And when they're working with governments, as they typically do, that's a situation that's quite different from having a printing press and sending things out. Centralization includes the major platforms. There's a lot of talk here this week about the platform companies, in particular Facebook. I should mention I'm working with Facebook on a project for media news literacy to help users of information be better at telling the difference between truth and lies, among other things. But Facebook's increasing control over conversation around the world alarms me a lot. There's no precedent for the size of Facebook. Google is another centralized internet technology company. The mobile phones that you use, there are really now two operating systems for most of the world. One is Apple's and the other is Google's. They're creating ecosystems that are in many ways quite controlled. If you want more security, you should use an iPhone. But Apple is extremely controlling in the way it allows people to use its phones. If you want to put your journalism out in an app on iOS, on the Apple platform, Apple gets to decide whether your journalism is acceptable. That's a centralization, again, that we've not seen in a long time. So I want to highlight that as an issue that journalists have to understand better, and I would hope also explain to audiences, because I don't think people we are trying to reach are fully aware of the reality of re-centralization or why it matters. And I hope that we as journalists will do more to help them understand it and perhaps work on providing or encouraging more competition and, if necessary, while I don't like regulation, I think we may have to have some in the future.
So I think we should take some questions. I don't know if there's a microphone. Can anyone tell me if there's a microphone? No? I guess not. So if you just want to shout, that would be great. I've got one question here, so we'll go with you first. Would you like to... Oh, wait a minute, there's a mic coming.
So my first question was just one of understanding. You were just mentioning that journalists, if they want to put their journalism up in an app, they will be judged by Apple in a certain way. Could you elaborate on that? Because maybe it's just me, but I do not understand the concept fully.
So it's a little bit complicated, but if you do your things on the web, if your journalism is on the web, Apple has nothing to say about whether it's okay or not. But if you're with a journalism company and have an app that you provide your journalism through, and the apps have to be installed via the Apple store, the online store, Apple decides what apps are acceptable to be downloaded that for users to put on their phones or tablets. Apple makes a decision if it's acceptable or not. And they have made, in some cases, some amazingly bizarre decisions. A political cartoonist in the United States was barred from the Apple store, and this was reversed. Apple got just punished in a public relations way, because it was incredibly stupid for them to do that, and was against free speech in every way, and they reversed that. But Apple does get to choose whether your app has acceptable content. So just keep that in mind. It's probably a good reason to focus more on the web. Facebook gets to decide what's acceptable in its platform, and has removed things that it found unacceptable. And again, things get challenged, sometimes things get put back, sometimes not. But if you're putting your work on someone else's platform, just understand that they get to make a lot of decisions about whether it's going to stay there. Yeah.
Any other questions? Anybody else want to ask a question? So, yes, one in the back, and then, so we can take that one and then the one at the back together, I think.
Hello, I have a question for either the journalists from Hungary or Russia. Do you know any of the journalists that work in the sort of government-controlled media, and do you know how do they cope with the either lying or telling the truth in a certain censored way? What's their take, their stance on their own activity, which seems sort of morally bankrupt?
Okay, and then there's another guy right at the back with the greyish jacket. We can take that question as well.
If you're an organization that creates content, can you talk a little bit about the considerations you would weigh when deciding to provide your content via, a platform like Facebook or via the App Store of Apple and so on?
Okay. Thomas?
Okay, so how critical journalists can make the government accountable? It's very difficult in Hungary because nowadays we have two parallel media universes. So there is the pro-government ecosystem of pro-government media, which are telling completely different things than the critical or opposition media. And there is almost no contact between these two worlds, so people need to decide which one they believe, because if you are not a pro-government journalist, you don't get a chance to ask a question for government politicians. They are carefully selecting the audience of their press conferences and of their public appearances, so that and they are not giving interviews to critical journalists. So the critical or independent journalists are mostly in a competitive. They can't compete with pro-government journalists in access to government politicians. They need to use like freedom of information requests or other more complicated ways to make the government accountable and have their questions answered.
Well, when it comes to Russia, people are not really willing. People who are working for the state media, for the propaganda media, they are not really willing to tell about what they are really feeling until the very time they are quitting their jobs. And after that, they are quite eager to tell about their experiences. We've published at Colta a number of interviews with people who were working at the state TV, and it's an impressive reading. From my personal experience, I could say that I've got an acquaintance who was and still is working at the most infamous governmental TV program that is Vesti Недели, and he is a kind of a chief decision maker for them, and that is really the bottom. And when I've met him 2 years ago at the peak of the war in Ukraine, well, it was rather informal at and it was an accidental meeting at someone's dacha, and he was rather drunk. And so the first question he addressed me with was, when you'll win, will you illustrate me? And it was kind of impressive because, well, even I'm not so sure about about the fact we will win. In certain time, of course, you know, that growth always wins, etc. But the fact that that is the very thing they are thinking about was quite remarkable. That's it. And I wanted to answer the second question, the one about the Facebook as a platform, because for me it is a matter of huge interest. The thing is, Colta.ru is huge at Facebook, and so I'm closely following what is going on. And what I notice is a certain tendency I'd like to tell you about. While the popularity of things you are publishing or advertising at Facebook is increasing, the overall value of your publication as an entity is decreasing. People are reading you. They are switching to your publication from their Facebook flow, but they never remember where the thing was published at. And that is striking. I mean, they sometimes, if you're lucky, they remember the author. But it is mostly goes like that amazing thing I read at Facebook. It was published somewhere. I don't know where. There is a number of exclusions, and usually it is when a person is dissatisfied with the piece you've published. Then they are suddenly remembered that it was Colta that published that awful piece, and you are to be blamed for it. But mostly, people are noticing the platform, i.e. Facebook, the author, and mainly the subject. And this means that the value of what you are doing is also decreasing, and quite rapidly. You are becoming more and more anonymous when you're existing in the social networks. And I'm following it, and I am seeing that the number of people coming over to Colta's face page is decreasing rapidly, and the number of viewers coming over to a certain page with a certain piece, with a certain material, is increasing quite rapidly. But the overall level of interest towards Kolta is considerably low. And that's the new reality we are facing now. And we still have to decide what is to do about it.
I'll just say quickly, I live in Silicon Valley. I've been there a long time. I'm a big admirer of the technology industry for its achievements and for a lot of the things they've done. And Facebook and Twitter and Google and these others are incredible achievements, both technically and in other ways. I just urge journalists to think really hard and long about beyond tomorrow, beyond next week, beyond next month, and think about what their future will be if they become completely reliant on these massive platforms. Some journalists are going to decide that that's fine, that that's where they're going to be. My caution there is that if that's the way most journalism goes, then the platforms are going to pick the winners. And that will raise other very troubling issues for all of us. But I don't have a good answer, a good solution for getting out of this dilemma, because there is no precedent in human history for the power and the reach and the financial clout of these companies. There's nothing like it in our history. So we're all working our way through something new that's problematic. And by the way, that's also related to the economic issues facing journalism in a very direct way.
Just to pick up on that point, I just wanted to make two additional points. One is that in some countries, governments are urging platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Google, YouTube to take more of a role in taking down stuff. So we've seen discussions in the UK and Germany recently on how governments would like them to take a more proactive role on taking down things, taking down pieces that other people might find offensive, not just, and so basically reversing what has happened in previous times in the way that the internet works. And I think we should be very worried about that. Maybe on a more positive note, that we have seen in the last 6 months a rise in subscriptions to journals, to magazines, to newspapers that are doing proper investigative journalism. And I think part of that has come out from people actually realizing, and perhaps something they should have realized before, that if they want good, thorough journalism, then they have to pay for it somehow. And so just viewing everything on the internet is leading to this spiral into nothingness. So as journalists, maybe you need to spread the word, if you're a journalist, that journalism has to be paid for somehow, and it doesn't miraculously appear for free on the web without somebody somewhere doing work on it. And those, as I often say to people, you don't expect a plumber to come to your house and fix your plumbing crisis or do the work on your water pipes for nothing. So why would you expect a journalist to do all this for nothing? So in the UK, we've seen a publication called Private Eye, which is satire and news investigations, have its highest sales ever in its history. I know the New York Times has put on a lot of subscriptions. I was talking to an independent magazine shop in London that said the sales of news-orientated magazines are going up. So that is one way forward, but if that is to be the way forward, people have to understand the link between a job of work and some kind of financial payment. So any more questions? Very quiet crowd. So I think let's take these two here.
Hi, yeah. Dan was talking about apps on the iOS system. In some countries, like Malaysia, where I happen to live, the government has cracked down quite hard on websites that have been critical against them. And one of the things that independent journalists have done is to actually set up apps. So I can read stories on this app, which I can't read on the web if I try to access them because the government has stopped access. So don't apps provide some kind of way of getting the story out that wouldn't otherwise be there?
Okay, and there's a question right in front of you, I think. And this is the last question, I've just been told.
Okay, just a very quick one. Picking up as well on what Dan Gilmore was pointing out, how the situation will develop in the near future. The three of you have talked about the freedom of the press in each one of the countries and the situation. Just basically your prognosis in Hungary, Russia, and you've already pointed it out a little bit in the United States.
Okay, so if we can maybe ask each panelist to come up with some final thoughts for this session, taking one or both of those questions. Thomas?
Okay, so I think as far from now, for us, these news platforms are extremely helpful. So I see the dangers of Facebook and Google and so on. But at the present situation of Hungary, these are essential tools to get the stories out, because these are platforms which the government cannot control. So, for example, our readership, more than 50% comes from the Facebook, and we can be present on Facebook without government interference, while at the Hungarian public service media is ignoring our stories and is not carrying our stories. So I think in Eastern Europe right now, these tech companies play a very progressive role in enhancing the freedom of the press. But of course, I can imagine a later stage when there comes the firewall and the filtering list and so on, which could make our life more difficult.
Well, when it comes to apps or to the way we're existing at Facebook, I'm not really viewing it as a danger, but more as a challenge. Because, well, that's a new reality. People are not visiting your front page anymore, but they are still following you at Facebook. What can you do to become more visible, to stay visible, to regain your former authority? It is an interesting work to be done. What I do really treat as a danger is something completely different. And it is this newborn feeling of similarity I'm experiencing when we are talking about our common problems and common matters. What I was viewing in Russia for the last 5 years or maybe 15 years was something that used to seem to me very peculiar. Something that could happen only in Russia, maybe. Some special brand of old disease, of a black box or something like this. And now I'm suddenly noticing lots of points of similarities all around the world. Not only in Hungary or Poland, but also in Britain, in France, in the UK, the US. And that sudden unity, that feeling of a changed sensibility in the ways the world is percepting the modern times is something to be aware of. And I can admit that it scares me. It does, a lot.
I have to be quick. I'm always optimistic in the long term. It's hard to be optimistic in the short term right now. But it's one thing that's happened in the U.S. since the election is, I think, a growing recognition of the value of serious journalism. That, as somebody in an earlier panel said, Trump has been good for journalism, for real journalism. And I think that the journalists around the world need to work together and need to learn from each other. I think we have some difficult times ahead, but I have a very strong faith that humanity will get this right in the end, but not without a lot of problems in the meantime.
So just to finish up, if anybody is interested in small reports on attacks in media freedom in Europe, I have a couple to give away at the end if anybody would like them. And there's another session tomorrow morning at 9:15 on media freedom and censorship. So if you want to carry on this conversation, do come along to that one. So in the meantime, I'd like to thank you all for coming and also to thank the speakers.
No, it did. I mean, Obama's whistleblower war was the worst thing for journalism.
Thanks very much. We were on time. Yes, thanks. No, I just thought you might notice it. Excuse me. Any question, please take it outside because we have another event and we need room. I'm sorry. Thanks very much.
And the moderator of the next session.
Perfect. So please,
I have two.
Dealings with the state, so their businesses are closely tied to the goodwill of the political powers, and that puts a serious limit or a constraint on how their media can expose corruption and political scandals. So I looked around how other countries deal with this problem, and I noticed that there are a lot of non-profits for investigative journalism, because that eliminates the problem of the politically connected owner who doesn't like you to expose his business partners in political parties and in the government. And the non-profits are owned by the journalists themselves who do the actual work. So I decided to try this business model in Hungary and funded this non-profit, and it is successful. So after 5 years, we are 6 journalists and a lot of freelancers work for Atlas. So, but it's still a very small enterprise, and it has become under attacks from the government and governing parties for its critical coverage. Unfortunately, in Hungary, what we are experiencing now is that the government sees the media as a tool for preserving its power. So what the government did is to turn we have a huge state-owned media, so-called public service media in Hungary, which is run by.
Be covering subjects, obstacles, including propaganda techniques, old and new, digital surveillance, digital techniques being used by governments to both to surveil journalists, but also to influence the public debate, which we're seeing used in lots of different ways in lots of different countries. Commercial pressure on journalists and how that can influence or attempt to influence journalism today, and also threats in other forms. So I'm going to pass over to Thomas, who is going to kick off just to talk a little bit about who he is and what's happening in Hungary.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Tamás Bodok. I'm a journalist since more than 20 years now, and 5 years ago, I funded a small NGO for investigative journalism in Hungary. The reason why we started this NGO is because the freedom of the press in Hungary is more and more in danger. In the early 1990s, the press played a very progressive role in fighting the powers and distributing democratic values, but then gradually it became a tool of different political and business interests, and in the 2000s even most of the foreign investors left, media investors left Hungary, and the media owners now are businessmen who typically made their fortune since the 90s, even in strong the state, and costs the taxpayers a lot of money. And before 2010 it was more or less independent, but now it has been turned into a propaganda machine for the government, and all the journalists are so-called pro-government journalists there. And also the government is buying private media or buying media companies and turning them into pro-government mouthpieces, while the jobs for critical journalism or independent journalism are shrinking. Opposition media is shrinking, and a huge propaganda machine is trying to discredit whatever we come up with.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Maria Stepanova and I come from Russia. Thank you for being here in this glorious summer afternoon. I'll try to say a few short words about what we are doing. I am a founder and an editor-in-chief of the Kolta.ru. It was founded 10 years ago as a cultural daily publication. Because we had this feeling that cultural issues were undercovered at the time. But as the time passed, and well, in the next few months, we found out that we just have to add a society section to our daily routine, because the events in Ossetia happened in the autumn of 2008, and we had just we had no choice but to follow them. Now, we used to exist under a different name, OpenSpace.ru, and in the spring of 2012, the spring of protests in Russia, our website was closed, and we reopened it after under a different name and in a different and following a different business model. And now Kolta.ru is an only it was the first one, and it's still an only totally crowd-funded publication in Russia. This means we are constantly facing a challenge, because it is easy to raise some money for launching something, for making a new film, for instance, or even for launching a publication. But it is rather hard to find money month after month in a hostile environment. When I am thinking of things we are doing, and we are getting more and more political with every year and every month. Of course, when you're writing about culture, well, cultural is political, but we are facing to be more and more direct. There is no choice, as it seems. I kind of hesitate to speak about what we are doing as a sort of an activism, because there is a number of people and publications who are much more brave, and they are struggling against the state's pressure every day. But when you come to think about what is going on in Russia currently, every kind of an independent activity rapidly becomes activism. And especially if you are having in mind a number of newborn laws directly that were issued directly to silence the independent media. I will name just a few things that could happen instantly to any kind of a publication, including personal blogs with a certain audience, more than 3,000 followers. You can anytime face one of the following problems. You could be instantly blocked without a court's decision if the content of your publication is considered to be extremism. This could mean anything. Your publication could be named a foreign agent if what you are doing is treated as a political activity. That also could be anything. If you are covering, for instance, the elections or the problems that are existing in the Russian army, or whatever else. Anything could be named a political activity, and you could be persecuted because of that. Also, you could be subject to a penalty or even jailed in certain cases if your content is viewed as risky. For instance, if you're covering the gay rights issues, it could be called homosexual propaganda, and it becomes an easy cause for a legal process. And there is the worst thing. You are finding yourself in a situation of constant self-censorship. You're refusing yourself to touch certain subjects, trying to avoid the things I've just named. That makes an ordinary daily situation of every journalist